Welcome to Feedback Studio. Now this video is a kind of bonus feature like the extras you get on the hidden menu of a DVD. It follows on from the video where we introduced you to the Longform feedback panel in Feedback Studio. And this is the place where you can write your feedback at length or record your feedback in a 3-minute audio file. One of the problems that some people have with writing their feedback in Feedback Studio or in the older Turnitin is that it can just take a very long time. And often many of the things that we write are broadly repetitions of things we've already written 50 times before in other essays. Now sometimes the difficulties of managing the time constraints of marking a large number of assignments in a very compressed times means it's simply just difficult to write much at all in the feedback section, at which point students might start to see dramatic variations of the length and quality of written feedback they get, and this is not a good thing. Now, since the issue here seems to be about the amount of time taken to add blocks of written feedback, it seems a perfect spot for a little technological intervention, which might help make our lives a little bit easier. In the past, you might have had a series of pre-typed feedback phrases, maybe in a separate document, and then copied and pasted them across to your feedback when you needed them. Others of you might even remember when feedback was typed up in Word documents using macros to help automatically generate blocks of standard text that you could then quickly modify. Of course, now that we're all marking in web browsers using Feedback Studio, these macros don't work anymore, but there is another way in which we can achieve the same thing. For this particular method to work, we need to be using Google's Chrome web browser, although there is an option for Firefox which works just as well, and for anything else there are external applications that pretty much do exactly the same thing. So, we start with our Chrome browser and we want to find the Chrome Web Store. Now you can find this easily enough through the Apps button, or just type Chrome Web Store into Google and it will pop up. In the search bar we want to search for the plugin that is going to do the job for us. So type in Text Expander and press return. And here it is. Auto Text Expander. Now there are others that you can see here, Text Blaze, ProKeys, and there are even more if you expand your search criteria a little, and they all do pretty much the same thing. We're just using Auto Text Expander to illustrate how they all work. Now to install the plugin to Chrome, just click on the big blue button that says Add to Chrome. You get a small window telling you about the permissions the plugin needs, but essentially all you really need to do is just click on the button to add extension. And boom, there it is. The web page is opened up now. And this is where you can make changes to your settings and add your own auto text expansions. A little shortcut has appeared next to the address bar at the top of the browser as well, so that you can quickly go back to the page or add new information. Okay, let's look at how it works. At the top of the page here, we have import and export sections, which we'll come back to in a moment. What we want to look at first is the shortcuts section just below it here. We'll look at these 3 buttons in a moment, but just underneath them is a little slider that tells Auto Text Expander just how many seconds delay you need for the shortcut to be read. The shortcuts themselves are represented in 2 columns. On the left is the shortcut that you can create for yourself, just a sequence of letters. On the right is the exact text that will appear when you type in the shortcut. For example, if we look at the first example, the letters BRB will prompt Auto Text Expand to type in the words "be right back." If you type in the letters HBD, Auto Text Expander will write a birthday message, because nothing says you care like an Auto Text Expanded birthday message. So, just looking back at the slider for a minute, if you were to use the shortcut 8BD, the slider will determine just how much of a delay to expect between the H and the B and the D. After all, we all type at different speeds, And if you've got more than the default 750 milliseconds between the characters as you type, then as things stand, AutoText Expander will have given up and gone for a cup of tea before you even finish your shortcut, and nothing is going to happen. So you can vary this delay by using the slider. And generally speaking, most people will be fine with the default as it is set up. Okay, so far so pointless. How can this help with your marking? Well, I'm sure many of you are already well ahead of me and can see many of the ways in which you can use this. I'm just going to show you an example of how it might be used and then leave the rest to you. Now firstly, I don't really need any of these default examples, so I'm just going to delete them each by clicking on the little dustbin next to them. Okay, now I'm ready to start adding my own. You'll see that the three buttons just above the slider have been repeated at the bottom here. They're not different buttons, they're exactly the same, but it's quite useful for when your lists get a little bit longer. If we press the Add button, we'll have a blank shortcut set appear in which we can add our own text shortcut and the text that we want to expand into. Now, writing out our sections here can take a little bit of time and planning, and it might be worth writing them out first in a Word document before you put them into the plugin itself. There are clearly going to be some passages that you find yourself writing over and over and over again that you'll immediately recognise as things that you could do with being automatically inserted. Some of my favourites are always things like, please remember to put book titles in italics, or you really need to support your points with a wider and more appropriate range of sources. And we could simply collect our most common passages of text and add them into the list, drawing on them as and when we need. However, it's possible to do even more than this. In a way, it is possible to think of your feedback in terms of a flexible kind of rubric. For each assignment, there are going to be things that students are expected to do, and how well they do these things is what will determine their grade. For example, how well have they used sources to support their points? Now, if they'd used their sources perfectly, then you might characterize it with feedback like, you use your sources convincingly and consistently throughout, supporting all of your key points with directly relevant evidence that you reference with meticulous care, using the correct referencing conventions. That sounds like a really good one. At the opposite end of the scale, if you imagine someone whose use of sources is just appalling, then you might imagine saying something like, it's a shame that you've not used any evidence to support your points in your essay. The supporting of your points by referencing appropriate sources is using the correct referencing conventions is something that is essential at this level of study, and you will struggle unless you address this issue urgently. It's strongly recommended that you seek urgent support to make sure you understand the expectations of academic writing more clearly. Now, as far as their use of sources go, you might think that the first example is good enough for a first-class grade, and by contrast, perhaps the second is maybe a fail. Okay, but then if these examples suggest a first and a fail, then what might suggest a grade somewhere in the 40s? It can't be as bad as a fail, but it's probably going to be something that has only just done enough and not much more. Perhaps something like this. You support your points with some sources, but it would be a good idea for you to think about doing this more consistently throughout your essay. Your choice of sources might do with some work as well. It's important to remember that the sources you use need to be appropriate to this level of study. Remember as well that you're expected to be able to use academic referencing conventions consistently and accurately throughout all your work, so it's worth paying more attention to your use of Harvard conventions and seeking support if you're still a little unsure about it. Now, as we build up our feedback, we're developing this kind of extended rubric. If an assignment demonstrates all the characteristics of our first example, then at least in this respect the essay looks like it's heading for a first-class grade. If the essay demonstrates all the characteristics of our second example, then it looks like it's heading for a fail. If we add feedback for a third-class grade, a 2-2 and a 2-1, well, then we've got a framework of a set of feedback to suit the sources of any essay. Having tackled the issue of sources, then perhaps we can think further to other areas of the essay that it's required to address. Here's an example of some generic feedback statements for a Level 4 essay based on the analysis of a particular theory of language. The broad requirements for the essay, based on the learning outcomes, revolve around an explanation of the theory itself, understanding of the contexts of the theory, analysis of specific scenarios, use of sources to support points, structure of the essay, and clear written expression. Now, it might take some time, but I can create a default block of feedback for each of these areas, one for each grade category. I won't use them all in this example, don't worry, but how do we use them? Well, first, we need to think about our keyboard shortcuts. Of course, what you decide to use is going to be entirely dependent on your own preferences. Personally, I use the grade categories with which the feedback is assigned. So, for example, use of sources might be abbreviated as SRC. A first-class use of sources would therefore be 1 SRC. A 2-1 would be 2-1 SRC, and so on down to an F SRC for a fail. And eventually, I might have a list that looks something like this. I can now add these paragraphs into my auto text expander boxes. I'll just copy and paste the text into the boxes and add my keyboard shortcuts into the shortcut boxes. It's important as you do this to remember to keep saving. When you've finished the process, then you might want to make sure that you have a backup copy of this set of feedback. Now, some auto text expanders will synchronize with different computers so that if you closed down on one machine and logged into another machine, you'd still find the same content. However, in this instance, there's no synchronization, so I'm going to save this set. It's possible to use the backup function here, but I'm going to use the export here, and I'm going to use the import-export button to do it. Here, I'm going to simply copy and paste the formula text in this dialog box and save it into a separate file. The more I get used to doing this, eventually I might find that I have a whole series of files containing the generic feedback for all of the assignments that I have to mark. In order to use any of them, I simply need to copy the text of the file and paste it into the import box of the AutoText expander. Save, and there, you're ready to go. Okay, now we get to the fun part of actually using this thing. Let's go back to our Feedback Studio assignment. In the Longform feedback section, we can now add our standard feedback sections by simply typing in the shortcut that we've predetermined. In our example, if we think the essay has used sources really well, but with one or two small problems, then we might suggest a 2-1 SRC. Now from here, of course, we can modify the feedback to any specific needs of the particular assignment, perhaps using specific examples from the essay of things that can be improved, or of things that are particularly good examples that they should try and do more of. What you'll hopefully find by using a system like this is that your feedback will be of a more consistent length from essay to essay, and it will be more consistently helpful to students as well, all the while taking actually less time than it might normally take to write up individualized feedback for each essay. So there we have it, a tip for writing long-form feedback more quickly. Why not give it a try?